right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah this week. Sarah is going to bring us through the IEP process, which we're all looking forward to, and the legalities around that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sarah, and she can get us started. And I know that this training is being recorded and will be posted. Colleen usually gets the link out to the directors and everyone shortly, within a day or two. So hopefully we'll be able to let everybody get the recording as soon as possible if they're not joining us today. Go ahead, Sarah.
All right, well, FAPE Nation, this is the big one, right? It's only taken us, what, 4 episodes to wind up to the point where we're finally going to talk about what is a FAPE. And, you know, I hate to hold people in suspense for no good reason, even though 'tis the season of secrets and suspense. As you've probably all figured out, the reality is there is no such thing as one giant FAPE in the sky, right? What is FAPE is going to be as individualized as the child that you're working with. And so when we're going to talk today about what is the substantive standard for FAPE, we all need to be thinking about it in the context of these are the substantive parameters that create FAPE, but what actually creates FAPE for each child is going to be unique. All right, well, we're getting very excited for the holidays around here at Casa Crazy. In fact, it was the most 2020 thing of, well, 2020, when I went out to the mailbox yesterday, and lo and behold, there was an Amazon package for FAPE Cat. I don't understand when this started, but apparently it's a thing now where cats send each other holiday gifts using Amazon. This to me is a symbol of something, and I'm not really sure how to process it, but having received a gift, FAPE Cat now feels obligated to send gifts to his friends. So off to the Amazon we go this afternoon to pick appropriate cat gifts for all the felines on FAPE Cat's list. Like I said, welcome to 2020. All right, so I'm going to go with the share screen, see if we can get our operation up here. Ta-da! Now I'm going to have to maneuver it to figure out how to get it so that I can actually run the PowerPoint. Come on, over here, down here. Ah, there we are. Okay, so as you know, we have not made much progress down our little list of things since we are still on the develop the IEP part of the list. But because we're going to talk about it in terms of procedural and substantive, let's do a quick review of last week. So last week, when we talked about what are the procedural requirements for FAPE, we talked about needing to make sure that you had a correctly constituted IEP team, that you carefully considered parental input and participation in the process. You made sure to look at all the evaluations and other information that you had in front of you. You didn't make any predeterminations. You didn't use terms like we always or we never do that. You worked toward consensus. And then if and when there's no consensus, you make an offer of FAPE and you go ahead and implement the plan in a timely manner. So today, like I said, we're going to go and move on to the substantive piece. So 1982, Rowley talked about there being 2 parts to FAPE, procedurally and substantive. And when it got to substantive, Rowley says, we hold that the state, or the LEA like CDS, satisfies the FAPE requirement by providing personalized instruction with sufficient support services to permit the child to benefit educationally from that instruction. So the first thing obviously to highlight about that definition, personalized. In other words, it has to be unique to the child's needs. And then it talks about to access and benefit from their education. And that has been interpreted to mean some educational benefit, or other words, non-trivial, more than de minimis. And we know this because the Supreme Court told us just recently in 2017, although after 2020, it feels like about 47 years ago, that a student's IEP must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. The goals may differ, but every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. So for a very long time, the First Circuit, which is important to us because Maine is in the First Circuit, which means that when the First Circuit makes a decision, it's binding in Maine, has tried to explain as best they can about what does it mean to have an appropriate education. Appropriate rather than ideal, adequate rather than optimal. Appropriateness and adequacy are terms of moderation. Though an IEP must afford some educational benefit to the handicapped child, and you can tell how old this case is because we referred to children as handicapped children, the benefit conferred need not reach the highest attainable level or even the level needed to maximize the child's potential. In 2012, we got an answer as to what is that some educational benefit that the First Circuit was talking about. In DB versus Esposito, the First Circuit said educational benefit must be meaningful and that the IEP team needs to consider an individual child's capabilities and potentialities, a word I would like you to know that I had never heard of until I read this opinion, when determining if a plan is in fact reasonably calculated to provide meaningful benefit. So it looks like the First Circuit had set us up very well for what was going to come from the Supreme Court in Andrew F. And essentially, the courts of the First Circuit have ruled that the First Circuit's meaningful educational benefit standard fully comports with Andrew F. It already requires consideration of the individual child's circumstances. And in 2018, the First Circuit was clear, the meaningful educational benefit standard remains the standard by which IEPs are judged in our circuit. So after Andrew F., all over the country, there was a little bit of concern and worry about what did this mean for all of your IEPs? In other words, had the Supreme Court given us a new FAPE standard? And while I would certainly argue that out in the 10th Circuit, where Andrew F. came from, it was definitely a new standard because their old standard was show me anything, no matter how minimal. That certainly wasn't the case in the First Circuit. And so we were well situated even after Andrew F. Okay, there is no dispute, no source of special ed law will say anything other than that FAPE begins with the IEP. In fact, many times FAPE both begins and ends with the development of the IEP, because in the absence of an appropriate IEP, you are not going to be able to deliver FAPE. I have never seen a decision, and I'm pretty sure none exists, where either a hearing officer or a court says, the IEP was terrible, yet somehow accidentally the student received FAPE. And if you think about it, that has to make sense, because if the IEP is in effect the agreement between you and the parent about what makes FAPE, if you don't have that, you're sort of, well, stuck on square one, for lack of a better term. So you might think of it as there are no accidental FAPEs. FAPEs don't just happen. FAPEs are what the IEP sets out. So I'm going to take this discussion of the IEP and do it in 3 parts. First of all, the development of the IEP. Second of all, the contents of the IEP. And then finally, a little bit about the implementation of the IEP. Okay, so let's start with not FAPEs. People. You will not have a FAPE if the IEP team doesn't include the parent, if the IEP team doesn't have people who know the student or who know the information about the student. Let me pause there, because I know that in the world of CDS, there are sometimes situations, you may be familiar with them, when the team meets to develop an IEP and none of the CDS administrators or providers, the regular education teacher, the special education teacher, have ever laid eyes on the student. You might not even have the individual who conducted the evaluations present, because as we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about evaluation, when the evaluations go to the IEP team, there is no legal requirement that the evaluator, him, herself, needs to be there, but there needs to be someone there who can interpret the evaluation results and explain the impact on educational activities. So what does that mean for this little star number 2? If you don't have people who have laid eyes on the child, then you need to be extra sure that the people have read the information about the child. In other words, nothing gets an IEP team meeting off to a worse start in terms of coming at FAPE if the people sitting around the table don't know the child's name without reading it from the evaluation, and, take every opportunity to get the information from the people sitting around the table who do know the child. Because who's sitting at the table knows the child? I guarantee you, if you followed bullet number 1, the parent knows the child. Think about that when you think about starting off your IEP team meeting. If you don't have educators that have worked with the child, the first person who should speak is the parent to talk about their child. Other problems, not having someone who knows the general curriculum. Again, what are you trying to do here when you're developing an IEP? You need to make sure that you have it linked to or reflecting what the general curriculum is for children that age. So another question that comes up to think about. You know from the evaluations, and maybe some of you have even laid eyes on the child, that this is a student that is significantly delayed. This is a student for whom looking at the general curriculum for pre-K, for 4-year-olds, would not be helpful to reflect their developmental knowledge. It's okay to look to younger standards, but you need to be focusing on a standard. In other words, FAPE can't be floating around in the ether. It needs to be linked to something. And if you have a child who is clearly working or progress is behind age grade or behind typical developmental age, you need to find an alternate standard that is appropriate. Okay, the last bullet is one that I would think would be obvious, but we seem to have issues with it. So suppose everybody knows that the issue with this child is speech language. I'm just going to throw it out there, but having an OT as the related service provider, oh, look, FAPE Cat's here to assess the FAPE. That's wonderful. Can you just maybe, yeah. Oh, yeah, they don't need to see your bottom. No, no one wants to see that. Anyway, you need to make sure that the people you have around the table are the people who reflect the areas of the student's need. Because otherwise, there's a disconnect right at the beginning, right? You don't need to have an OT as your related services provider if there's no indication that OT is an area of concern, and it's obvious that speech is an area of concern, but you have no one who can speak to speech. See the issue? Okay, second category of development issues. You will not have FAPE if the team either doesn't have the necessary information. In other words, you don't have the evaluation reports, you don't have comments from the parent, comments from other people who know the child and who have seen the child. Or, my personal favorite, when the team doesn't use the information it has. And so you never want to be in a situation where you in fact have the information, yet the IEP that results doesn't seem to have any relationship to that information. So you need to have the right people and you need to have the right information. And that's not just a procedural issue, to be clear. These are reasons that an administrative hearing officer or a court will say, this IEP doesn't equal FAPE. MUSER requires you to have 4 basic considerations in the development of an IEP. The first one, I would argue, is possibly the most important: the strengths of the child. The IEP process involves leveraging strengths. I can't say it more clearly. I have seen more administrative hearings go south when it's very clear that the only thing the IEP does is make a long list of things that the child can't do without ever suggesting what the child can do, and more importantly, what are the things the child likes or does well. Second required consideration, the concerns of the parent for enhancing the education of their child. I cannot say this too many times. We talked about it last week. There are 2 supernovas at the IEP team meeting. One of them is going to be the CDS authorized representative, who is ultimately responsible for committing resources of CDS. The other is the parent. The results of the initial or most recent evaluations of the child. Again, this may seem like we're going over and over something, but there's a reason you went through that whole evaluation process, right? It would make no sense whatsoever to go through all that and then ignore it. And remember, you're looking at the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. And for a child who's age 3 to 5, those latter 2 are more important than ever. To be clear, you are responsible for academic needs of 3 to 5-year-olds. I want to be crystal clear about that. There is no such thing as 3 to 5-year-olds don't have academic needs. They absolutely do. But you also have to consider developmental and functional needs. Okay. After the 4 required considerations, there are 5 what we refer to as special factors, which may or may not be necessary to consider depending on each child. The first one, it's a biggie, behavioral issues. Is this child's ability to access educational opportunity being hindered by behaviors? And if so, what can you do and how do you configure positive behavioral interventions and supports to help that child be able to stay with their educational programming? English proficiency. You need to consider the language needs of the child as those needs relate to the IEP. And just to be clear, When we talk about parental participation and meaningful parental participation, it should go without saying, but I'm going to remind you anyway, because we just had a complaint situation about this, where parent did not speak English as their primary language, and the SAU, for reasons I do not understand, had several IEP meetings where there was not either a translator present or a language line or other way to ensure that the parent was understanding the proceedings. You cannot have meaningful input by the parent if you have reason to believe that they aren't able to understand the language in which you're running the meeting. For blind and visually impaired students, you need to consider instruction in Braille and the use of Braille unless the team determines that is not appropriate because of the unique age, abilities, etc. of the child. For children who are deaf and hard of hearing, language and communication needs and the opportunity for that child to be able to communicate with their peers and with the professional personnel in the child's language or communication mode. So, I'm going to remind you that children who are deaf and hard of hearing is the only exception to what I call the methodology rule. Generally speaking, a school or a CDS site can choose the manner in which you do the instruction. So in other words, you decide whether or not floor time or ABA. You decide whether or not Wilson reading or Spire or Seeing Stars. The one exception to this, and it is absolute, is that the parents of children who are deaf and hard of hearing get to decide and tell you which means of communication they want their child to use. And you then are obligated to provide appropriate accommodation, modification, and instruction in line with that choice. So the one choice that is absolute is the method by which a child who is deaf or hard of hearing will communicate. That's told to you by the parent, and then you go forward with that. Now, that doesn't mean that your colleagues from the Maine Educational Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and like organizations won't be working with the family in many cases to help them choose what means of communication they would like their child to use. It can be an important part of early intervention for families with a child who's deaf or hard of hearing to work on that all-important decision about communication. But when a family comes to you having chosen a communication methodology, you need to adopt that and adapt your appropriate programming to that. Finally, if necessary, you need to think about assistive technology devices and services. If anything good has come out of this pandemic, it's that we are now looking at assistive technology and technology as a whole as being a lot more universally acceptable. So don't forget it when you're thinking about developing your IEP. Okay, so once upon a time, the Supreme Court told us that an IEP really shouldn't be that complicated because after all, the statute tells you everything that has to be in it. Once again, people who've never once sat at a table as a member of an IEP team. But it is factually true that MUSER and the IDEA identify 8 statutory requirements that have to be in every IEP, and 6 of them pertain to preschool children with disabilities. But there's an overarching concept here, and I can't be more clear about how important this is. If I had my whiteboard and was able to do this the way I used to be able to teach, because of course I haven't managed the skills, someone's going to tell me, oh, there's a program where you can do this on the Zoom. Yeah, not there yet. But you have to picture my whiteboard, okay? You start where the child is. You end where the team thinks the child should be at the end of the period covered by the IEP. And then in between these two goalposts is the plan that assists the child to get from point A to point B. That's what an IEP is. Where the child is, what is your best estimate of what a reasonable place for them to be in 1 year, because remember, we're doing these IEPs annually. And then everything else in between is what is it going to take to assist the child to get from A to B. If you get that, more times than you will know, you have FAPE. That is the key to FAPE. So let's start at point A. Point A, present levels of academic and functional performance. You cannot have a plan, and you certainly cannot have goals that will be found to be reasonable if you don't define your starting point. Not just a display of what factual information you have, but you need to relate it to how that would impact a child's ability to participate in the general education curriculum, or for preschoolers, in appropriate developmental activities. So if in fact you have kids where it's difficult to link them to the general education curriculum, appropriate activities. This is your chance to describe the problems that are obstructing, adversely affecting the child's educational performance. It includes both academic and non-academic, behavioral, communication, mobility, daily life skills. How are your little people getting through the day, and in what way or ways does their disability hamper their ability to engage in these developmentally appropriate activities? Think about all the sources of information that you have to bring to bear on this. You have test scores, you have evaluations, you have observations. You have the ability to get information from people who know the child and interact with the child on a regular basis. The parents are the most obvious example, but what if the child has been spending significant time in a daycare setting? Of course, you want to hear from the people at the daycare setting. So you're going to set the present levels of academic and functional performance first. Okay, here at number 2 is the other end, right? These are the goals. This is what you're going to try to get the child to. What the child needs to do to be able to access and benefit from their education. Now, for children 3 to 5, they should be aligned with the early learning and developmental standards. In other words, that's the general curriculum, but they have to meet each of the child's other educational needs as well. Now, generally speaking, I like to see IEPs that have at least one goal for each identified area of need. If you've identified an area of need, yet there isn't a goal on the IEP around it, that raises questions. So there are a couple of times when I could picture an IEP that delivers FAPE that does not have a goal for each identified area of need. The most common one is what I call sequencing. In other words, if you have a child that is significantly delayed and is at age 3, there is a limited amount that you can put in to a single IEP and expect within a single year. That's just reality, right? This is a 3-year-old. So I would understand if the team decided to make a priority list and have goals that reflected those priorities. That having been said, I would be very nervous if in a second year, there was still an identified area of need that wasn't addressed. In other words, it's not a permanent sideline, but I understand sequencing. The other time where I could picture not having a goal for each identified area of need, sometimes, even with very young children, parents are extremely hesitant to have certain types of activities. So for example, with older kids, it often involves counseling and social work services and working on, let's call them, those type of issues. You will need to make a decision whether or not and when to pick battles over services and goals that it is obvious that the parent is reluctant to acknowledge. It doesn't mean that you don't have the obligation to serve the child in all areas, but you're smarter about this than I am. This is where you do well and lawyers do, what's the word I'm looking for? Less well. You need to form relationships with these parents, and you need to use the trust that you build with these families to get to a point where they will be more accepting to consider these other ideas. But no, I'm not saying that you have to pick the mother of all fights by forcing that into a first IEP. So the other thing that we need to talk about in terms of goals are projections. The test that you are going to be rated on is whether or not your goals are reasonable projections forward. There is no requirement that you be Nostradamuses. In other words, there's a reasonableness standard to you looking forward. You're going to think about things about past achievements and rates of progress. You're going to think about the present level of performance. Like I said before, prioritization and sequencing can be important. You need to allocate time and resources based on this child's unique needs. So those are the two endposts. There has to be a match between what you said the child's current levels, present levels of performance are, and what you are setting as measurable goals for the year. Goals should be set at what you believe the child has a reasonable chance of achieving. The goals are annual, and so you're always thinking about it in terms of what can you achieve within a year. So let me try the two different ends of goals. First, why are overly ambitious goals bad? Of course, there's a huge desire on everyone's part to fix everything immediately, right? And to be clear, I have actually seen IEPs for children 3 to 5 who are significantly developmentally delayed, where the goal is to be up with their age peers by the time they get to kindergarten. Now, these are IEPs that have two problems. First of all, if it's your first year, in other words, the child is 2 years away from kindergarten, that's not annual. That's 2 annuals. But second of all, again, even I, as a non-professional, look at the present levels of performance, and it is not realistic to suggest that this child is going to be along or at the level of his or her age peers entering kindergarten. There's nothing worse in some ways than creating false hopes. In other words, you want your families to be committed, as you are, to having ambitious goals, but not overly ambitious. You don't want people to think the child is failing, when in fact, they are performing at about exactly the developmental pace that the evaluations would suggest. Turn it around. Why unambitious goals are bad? Well, first of all, they're going to violate the Andrew F. standard, right? There's no question that after Andrew F. and our First Circuit Court has been clear that the goals need to be ambitious. Not unrealistically ambitious, but ambitious. Okay. Many of you remember a time when we didn't say goals, we said goals and objectives. The last iteration of IDEA took objectives out of the picture and said you only need to have short-term objectives for students who are taking alternate assessments. Now, obviously, your students don't take the assessments that they were thinking of, right? Because when they say alternate assessments, they're talking ESEA language. In other words, the kids who are being assessed using the state assessment through an alternate means. You know, I never had a problem with having objectives in IEPs for preschoolers. I actually thought that it was pretty effective, given that, generally speaking, many of these kids had never been in structured educational programs until they came to you. And so having things broken down in a way that helped them, get a more regular take on what's going on, that sort of made sense to me. On the other hand, people who know preschoolers more than I do, which would include just about everyone except for FAPE Cat, know that kids don't develop in a straight line. You're probably sitting here thinking, oh God, this lawyer and her linear approach to the world. All you need to do, she says, is get from point A to point B like this. Have you ever met a child that develops like this? And I'm guessing the answer is no. And I'm also guessing that my mother would say the same thing. So my whole obsession with being linear clearly came later in life. So there are good reasons, there are bad reasons, but in the end, the point is that you only need to have objectives in a case of students who are so far off the developmental norms that they would essentially be taking alternate assessments. Okay, a description of how the child's progress toward meeting the annual goals will be measured, and when periodic reports on the progress the child is making will be provided to the parent. Okay, IDEA 2004 literally should have been captioned measurability matters, because there was an increased emphasis on accountability. In other words, setting measurable goals and then actually measuring them. And measurability, in my mind, is the close partner of monitoring. You need to keep a hold of what's going on with these IEPs over the course of the year. And the way you do that is by looking at the periodic reports that you're getting at the same time as the parent. And if the student is not progressing at the expected rate, then the team needs to meet and talk about it. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is setting your plan with your reasonable expectations and then not following it. In other words, you cannot ignore what happens once the plan starts being implemented. Because if it starts going wildly off your line, the answer is do something. And the do something starts very simply, which is have an IEP team meeting. It may be that the IEP team will reach consensus not to do something yet. In other words, not changing the plan, nope, that's okay. You've met your obligation by having the meeting and discussing it. However, sometimes you do need to take action. And there are essentially two things that I've seen people do as the IEP rolls forward. One of them is adjusting the goals. In other words, if you figured out halfway through the year that your goal is either way too tough or way too simple, you can change it. But the more common thing I see is adjusting services. In other words, what you realize based on the progress of the child is that either they aren't receiving enough or they're not receiving the right type of services. And all of that is completely appropriate for the IEP team to discuss and to redecide, alter the plan. It's not set in stone in the sense that just because you've developed it doesn't mean it cannot be touched until the next annual meeting. Okay, number 4, a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services to be provided. 2, advance appropriately toward attaining the goals, to be involved and make progress in the general curriculum or the appropriate developmental activities, to participate in extracurricular and other non-academic activities, and the bottom line, to be educated and participate with other children with disabilities as well as non-disabled children. So I want to be super, super clear here. This is what you are going to promise to deliver. Because, to be very, very, very clear, an IEP does not guarantee a result. In other words, an IEP does not fail simply because a student does not meet a goal that's in the IEP. That's not how it works. An IEP fails when you fail to provide the special education and related services that you've said in the plan you're going to provide, and as a result, the child doesn't advance appropriately toward attaining the goals. Because if you think about it logically, you cannot have, the plan can't be right if without receiving the special education and related services, the child meets their goals, right? How can that happen? Something went wrong. You have to consider peer-reviewed research to the extent possible. In other words, generally speaking, when we think about the services to provide, you're looking at methods, service providers that are generally considered to be doing things that the community views to be appropriate. Now, I underline this because I know you know it, but you need to say it to yourself like a mantra regularly. The services you offer must be based on the child's needs, not on the availability of the services. I understand that you're all generous, giving people who are in this job because you want to help children. And I know that one thing that you do when you can't provide a particular service is that you provide twice of something else. I know it, don't lie to me, I've seen way too much of your work. And your heart is 100% in the right place when you're trying to do that. The problem is, that is not FAPE. In other words, you're doing what you think is a good thing, but that doesn't advance the FAPE ball. What a child needs for services is based on what the child needs, not the services. So, Let's be clear about what we're talking about here. You're going to be providing special education, which is defined in IDEA and MUSER. And MUSER, as you can see, specifically adds for children 3 to 5, embedding goals into developmentally appropriate activities, designing appropriate learning environments, planning curriculum and treatment, including the interaction of personnel. And I want to be really clear about that. One of the things that happens with CDS, because you are using a bunch of independent contractors, is you need to be doubly careful that you're providing opportunities for those personnel to be working together on behalf of the student to make sure that they know what each other is doing. Now, Maine, as you know, includes speech language as special education. So you have kids who are literally identified and entitled to special education because of a need of speech language services. It doesn't work that way for OT or PT or any of the other related services. Related services, as you know, are the services that assist children with disabilities to benefit from special education. So let's think this through. If you have a child who is receiving special education because of speech language, the only related services that you would be providing are services that are allowing the child to benefit from their speech language instruction. So in other words, every once in a while, I see an IEP that has a whole list of related services, but no special education. You have to have special education first. So why do I have Cedar Rapids versus Garrett F on this slide? Let me tell you. There was for many, many years a debate about what constituted a medical service. And why was that important? Because as a related service, medical services are for diagnostic and evaluation purposes only. In other words, you don't provide, as part of your related services, medical services. And so the question was, what makes a service medical? Well, there's actually a pretty easy answer to that, thanks to the Supreme Court. It's a medical service if you need a doctor to do it. So in other words, you are able, through nursing contracts, to do everything medical that you can think of, as long as it doesn't take a doctor to do it. Okay, point number 5. An explanation of the extent to which the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the activities described in the regular class and in extracurricular or non-academic activities. This is, simply put, your LRE statement. What you need to do to have a compliant IEP is you need to describe the child's educational placement. In other words, it's not just a place, it's a description of the place. Is the child going to participate some of the time with their typically developing peers? How much and why? In other words, describe what's going on. This is important because once we have our little holiday break, we're going to come back in January and talk about LRE. And I'm going to go back over and over again. LRE has to match the description that you have put in the IEP. It doesn't make sense if you have an IEP that describes LRE as being the child is able to participate with their age peers 90% of the time, and then your placement is in a developmental preschool where there are no typically developing peers. the projected date for the beginning of the services, and the anticipated frequency, location, and duration. Okay, last week we talked about in Maine, you have to implement within 30 days of determination of eligibility. If you cannot implement within 30 days of the determination of eligibility, you need to reconvene the IEP team. The other thing, and this will be a conversation that also will flow into next week, location of services does not mean a specific provider. Location, placement, provider. 3 different things. Provider is simply the who. In other words, it's as if you were in elementary school and the decision was being made, should Sarah attend Ms. Red's class or Mr. Blue's class? That's a provider of services. That is not the same as the location of services, which in my example would be in a typical elementary school. And it is certainly not the same as saying that Sarah will be placed with Ms. Red or Ms. Blue. No, that is a provider. Okay, just to be fair, the 2 pieces of the IEP for the older children that you don't get to fiddle around with, state and local assessments and transition services. And by transition, I mean transition when they're in high school and looking beyond. Okay, so now that you have the 8 categories of what needs to be in the IEP, I'm going to go back to something I said last week, and I'm really going to drive this home. There needs to be one person who is responsible for the IEP. One. That one person's job as the responsible person on behalf of CDS for the IEP is to be the person that makes sure that you have present level, goals, and then you have the other 4 parts lined up in between. So between the present level and the goals, you have to have the services you're going to provide, frequency, intensity, and location, an LRE statement. In other words, all of those things need to come together and be on that string in between present levels and the goals. Because while there is no guarantee that the student will meet the goals, it is fair and reasonable for the parent to be able to look at the IEP and see a complete picture of what the next year is going to look like. That is what you have to deliver to the parent, and if they accept it, you've entered into an agreement that is essentially presumed to be a FAPE. Because if you have followed all of the procedural requirements and you have an IEP that has accurate present levels, has reasonable goals, and has a description of what it is you're offering, who's going to do it, what are they going to do, where is it going to happen, all of those parameters, that is your start of FAPE. That's it. And I would encourage you, again, FAPE is front-loaded. In other words, you take the time at the beginning in getting this plan in place, and it will pay dividends as you implement it. So, implementation. Okay, I suppose you all probably figured this out, but the first rule of implementation is that you have to actually deliver the program that's described in the IEP. Again, you cannot have FAPE in the ether. So if you deliver a fabulous education program that has no relationship to the IEP, you have a problem. Well, actually, you have more than one problem, but that is not going to work. There is not a requirement that your delivery be perfect. There is case upon case where hearing officers and courts have said that you begin to have a problem when what you deliver is substantively different than what's in the IEP, or when there's a substantial variance from the IEP. Let me give you an example. This was a complaint from Maine. So the school district was all ready to go in the fall. On the second day of school, their only speech language therapist announced happily she was pregnant. A month later, unfortunately, there was a complication and she was ordered to bed rest. No student in the district got speech language for the next 4 months. When the speech language therapist returned, instead of assessing all of the students to determine what had been lost in the 4 months that they didn't get speech language, the school district picked up right where things had left off. And not surprisingly, by the end of the year, not all of the students had met their goals. Some of the students had met their goals. And so this case sort of tested both sides of the problem, if you think about it. In some cases, the students were able to meet their goals despite missing literally half of the year, because basically speaking, 4 months was sort of half of the school year. On the other hand, all of these students had not met their goals because, not surprisingly, they hadn't provided the services in the IEP. So delivery is not required to be perfect, but it also can't be a substantial deviation, and having no services for half the year is quite clearly a substantial deviation. The golden rule of IEP implementation: if something isn't working, you need to demonstrate some sort of response. The number one thing you can do to violate the IDEA after you put the IEP in place is not to know or to do nothing if things aren't working. All right, so I know that this insults FAPE Cat as well as all of you, but here is today's code.
And we do have some questions in the chat box.
I am ready for questions. I was suspicious that this might, there might be some questions involved in this, because
Okay.
you know, this is not, okay, hold on. Done with the share.
All right. So the first question came through from Tyler Backus. It says, what is the parent's ability and district's responsibility if the parent has an outside evaluation that would impact the child's needs to access education? So he says, sorry, let me make it clearer. If the parents have an evaluation done through a private provider that provides additional information to the needs of the child to access their education. So I think basically what he's asking is, can an IEP consider an outside evaluation if it's above and beyond what the district has already, or the regional site has already evaluated for? I think is what he's asking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Remember, what you're going to do if the parent shows up with an evaluation is you're going to say, we'll consider it. Now, we'll consider it means that the team will in fact consider it, but it does not mean that you have to accept it as if it were your own, because it's entirely possible that whoever did this evaluation was not reading Muser when they were doing it. So it may not in fact comport with the requirements for the evaluation that we talked about a few weeks ago. You may also find out that it simply doesn't in any way jive with any of the information that the actual educators who have been working with the child believe is what's going on. In other words, we'll consider it means that you will make a good faith effort to work with it as an alternate source of information, but it does not mean that you have to accept it or its conclusions and make an IEP around it.
Thank you. So Gail Keeshan says, if a child has a documented physical disability, such as cerebral palsy, and cognitive and social skills may not be affected but shows significant delays in speech, OTPT, does this mean no motor services?
So here's the question. Speech is special education. So you need to ask them the question, what, if any, related services are necessary in order for the student to benefit from their special instruction, their special education, which in this case is going to be speech or language?
Okay, Allison Fuller. We will sometimes get doctor prescriptions for speech therapy, but the eval has them in mild delay range, which makes them not eligible. Parents can still go through the medical model, but do we have any responsibility at that point? Can we speak? Can you speak some to feeding services which cross OT and speech therapy?
Feeding, F-E-E-D?
It looks like.
Okay. So you have an evaluation from a competent physician, but what the evaluation says is that the child is only mildly delayed or does not meet your standard for being a child with a disability. Now, a couple of things. First of all, do you rely on one source for the up-down? No. You are going to consider multiple sources before deciding whether or not the child is eligible. That means they're not ineligible because the doctor said it was mild, and they're not eligible because it came from a doctor, if you know what I mean. The second part, if feeding services, all right, I have to say it, and some of you on this call, Lori Whittemore, I'm thinking of you, go back with me far enough to know I am the woman that thought that a sensory diet had to do with food. So I just want to be very clear that I'm approaching feeding services carefully. The same rule applies as to any other related service. If it is required in order to support the student in accessing and benefiting from their speech language therapy, then yes. And yes, I have improved my efforts with sensory diet. And in fact, if it weren't for FAPE Cat, I would be able to show you my fidget toys. Unfortunately, my fidget toys appear to be reclassified as cat toys at the moment.
Okay, next one. Often lately, there are many programs pigeonholing CDS to change determined services, i.e. 5 days, 3 hours a week, to 5 days, 6 hours a week, or the program won't consider them for program entry. This has happened before COVID and is continuing now. This is a very difficult situation, putting CDS in the middle. The parent wants the program, and the team has determined the frequency and intensity. In other words, there are very few programs available. So often now we have children waiting. I don't suppose there is any way around this, as a FAPE has been determined.
So my answer here is not meant to say that I don't think this is a terrible situation, because obviously you want to have the most possible places for your students to attend, and no child should be waiting for services. But the reality is, when I told you about the this, and everything in between, that's how it works. In other words, what you're looking at, you could think of as backwards FAPE. In other words, the parent loves the program, and the program is oh so helpfully telling the parent, oh, but if you get 6 hours a day instead of 3 hours a day on your IEP, we'd be happy to have your student. That's backwards FAPE. Nothing about FAPE works that way.
Right.
Again, if you determine as a team that the child needs a 6-hour-a-day program to be able to access and benefit from their education, that's one thing. But if 6 hours a day is the brainchild of their Maine Care Loving program, and understandably, the parent is in agreement because they want services for their child, that's not how it works.
The next question is kind of in addition to above, and I don't.
But wait, there's more.
I know, but this question really bothers me. To add the above comment, the IEP team determined a 3-to-1 ratio as appropriate to start the IEP, but the program says they will accept it if we change it to 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 before we were able to try 3-to-1, and referral was denied. So the program, it sounds like the program's making the decision, not the IEP team.
Yep. Again, not appropriate.
Right.
And it would be nice, although it still remains elusive, to be in a position where we can say to those programs, that's not how it works. And so no. Now, the problem, of course, as we all know, is that as long as they can run to someone and get a script, Maine Care will pay for anything. But that doesn't change your FAPE obligation. It just doesn't.
Okay, and then the last one, we were recently told we could do a speech eval and add an ed eval in to rule out developmental delay if there were also OT concerns, as we couldn't do OT SLP evals alone. My understanding is if SLP and OT, they then showed a delay over 1.5 SD, the child would receive those services even if the ed eval came out in the typical range. So again, I think what we're trying to figure out is what's the special education. If it's not an ed eval, then it might be the speech would be the special education. But where does OT come in?
So one thing, and I may be misunderstanding the concept of the question, but one thing I'm wondering about is, are you all thinking about developmental delay as an appropriate category to be considering? Because some of these students where they're showing delays in both speech and OT, the answer is perhaps not that you need to figure out whether or not some of these things can be attached to speech as the special education, but it's more a question of developmental delay.
Yeah.
And eligibility.
I agree with that, because we need to be considering developmental delay. Not afraid to do that, even though the user says it's the last disability that we should consider. And I think we're getting a little bit.
Saying it's the last doesn't mean it's the not or the ever.
That's right. Exactly.
In other words, I completely understand why what Muser is trying to do is always, when there's the possibility of putting a student into one of the categories that will follow him or her into big school, well, that's great, right? But that doesn't mean you don't serve a student who's developmentally delayed but doesn't fit into any of the categories.
Right. I think we've answered the question about DD that was just asked. Okay, folks, I think we're run over a little bit. I know some people have noon meetings to go to. This was awesome this morning, Sarah. And I'm sure that if we get further questions, we will be able to answer those as we move forward, and we'll add them to our next session.
Okay, again, so we're clear. We're having 2 weeks off for whatever holidays people choose to celebrate. I'm seriously leaning toward Festivus this year because I actually saw the Festivus episode of Seinfeld over the weekend. But whatever holidays you celebrate, by all means, celebrate the heck out of them. And we will return in January. I'm contemplating adding an 8th session, and the 8th session will be the C to B that we didn't get enough of for some people, or maybe we got too much of, which would be the week after. In other words, we just keep going in January. So if you want to put a hold on that, I'm still trying to figure out how to work a C to B into this.
Perfect. All right, folks, have a great day. Thank you, Sarah, so much for all this good information and training.
Bye.